What is Disney's Folly, and how can it help you to be braver to take risks? That's what we're going to discuss in today's video. G'day guys, Brock Layden. Let's get right into it. So, first of all, what is Disney's Folly? So, Disney's Folly is a term that was thrown around in the 1930s when people were basically taking the mick out of Walt Disney before he, clearly went on to the success that he was later going to have. And what they called Disney, if you don't know what folly means, folly essentially refers to like something that's foolish or doesn't make sense or isn't going to work, right? So they called this Disney's Folly, like Disney's foolishness, Disney's terrible idea. And what they were describing as Disney's Folly was Walt Disney's dream to create the first animated feature film, right? Because it's crazy to think back in those days. I mean, this is what I learned when I was reading about Walt Disney, right? Was that originally animated films were just kind of like these shorts. So you'd go to the cinema to go watch some, film that wasn't animated, and you might see a couple of shorts that were animated, some, less than 10 minutes long, let's say. But Disney basically had this vision and had this dream that one day people would go to the cinema and it would be to see a fully animated feature film. You'd be spending over an hour watching, something that was, animated. But at the time, like I said, there's literally this term that people would talk about. They would say Disney's Folly, and it would get thrown around because people just thought it was nonsense. Now, what ends up happening? So obviously Walt Disney starts his animation studio and he gets to work on the first animated feature film that they dropped was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which goes on to be a wild success in its time. Even when you look at the revenue that it generated and you account it and you account for inflation over the years, it still holds very well in today's numbers. It was a raving success. If you go forward 60 years or just less than 60 years, a little company called Pixar and a man named Ed Catmull, who was the co-founder of Pixar, have a dream and they want to create the first fully computer animated feature film. Very similar thing. People had made computer animated films, but they were shorts, right? Pixar saw into the future. They had a vision, and Ed Catmull in particular, backed by Steve Jobs as well. A lot of people don't know that Steve Jobs, he bought Pixar. He owned Pixar when all this was going on, and he lost so much money in the process. But he saw Ed Catmull's vision, which was fully computer animated feature films. And again, there were doubters in the industry. People thought it couldn't be done. The technology wasn't there yet, yada, yada, yada. And then what happens in 1995 is Pixar drop a film called Toy Story, and everything changes from there. Obviously, Toy Story goes on to become an instant classic. I saw just recently that they're doing Toy Story 5 this year or next year or something. It's still going. Pixar go on to do like all these amazing animated feature films, computer animated feature films. But again, people thought it wouldn't be done. And in the 90s, Pixar proved them wrong. So there are examples of people and companies being brave, willing to take on like criticism and being called crazy, and ultimately they end up making it. And it seems silly in hindsight, right? Like it seems silly to think that people in the 1930s called Walt Disney crazy for the fact that he wanted to make an animated feature film, because it's so common today. And in the same way, 60 years later, in the 90s, it's crazy that people thought the same thing about Pixar creating a computer animated feature film. And I feel like so often that's the way that these things happen, right? It seems crazy at the time, but then it happens and like it all plays out. It all makes sense. The other really like beautiful thing about the examples of Disney and Pixar is that they end up like working together. Like they work together on the film Toy Story, and then later down the line, Steve Jobs ends up selling Pixar to Disney. So it kind of comes full circle, and these two companies who defied the odds end up coming together to this day, where they still work together, and Disney still own Pixar. But there are examples of where it does work, right? And you might be thinking, well, that's all well and good. Like, you take a big chance, maybe you set an ambitious goal in your career, and if you meet it and you achieve it, then that's great. But like, there are also going to be times when you don't achieve it, right? And that's absolutely the case. You're not always, if you set these big ambitious things, the natural consequence of it is that you're not always going to land them. Like if you're always landing your goals, then it means that they're not ambitious enough. And I just finished reading a book by a man named Adrian Newey, and if you follow Formula One, you'll know the name. He's essentially like one of the goats of like engineering in Formula One. He's produced, I think it's like 10 championship winning cars or something like that. Anyway, I just finished his book, and in it he has just like a couple paragraphs where he talks about Sebastian Vettel. And again, if you're a Formula One fan, you'll know the name Sebastian Vettel. He's a four-time world champion of Formula One. And Adrian Newey, they both worked in the same team, Red Bull, for a period. That's why he's talking about him. And in the book, Adrian Newey has just like a couple paragraphs where he talks about what he thinks made a young Sebastian Vettel like so promising, so great, like develop so quickly. And what he basically outlined, he didn't quite do it in like, he didn't outline it in a 4-step process, but when you read it, basically is a 4-step process. He said that Sebastian Vettel like pushed the limits. He pushed the limits of the car, what the car was capable of. He pushed the limits like of himself, like mentally what he was capable of. He pushed the limits of himself physically, like he just pushed all the limits. Then the natural consequence of that was that like sometimes he crashed, whether it be literally in the car having a crash or like maybe from a mental perspective struggling. But the point is he pushed the limits, and obviously he probably gained a lot in the process, but he inevitably crashed. But then the next two things that Newey called out are key. He said Sebastian Vettel always like he blamed himself and he took ownership for the crash. He didn't try and blame it on outside people. He always tried to figure out what he did wrong that contributed to the crash. And then he learnt from it and he never made the same mistake twice. And I think that's a 4-step process for success. You push the limits, you push the boundaries, you crash inevitably, you take responsibility and figure out what part you played in it rather than trying to blame the outside world. And then you learn and you grow and you don't make the same mistake twice. And imagine you just keep doing that loop over and over and over and over again as, this is what Adrian Newey says Sebastian Vettel basically did, early on in his career in Formula One. You're just going to keep growing and you're going to grow faster than everyone else around you because you're crashing more. And the key thing is obviously you can't just crash, right? You got to crash and then take accountability and then learn and grow so that you don't make the same mistake twice. And it's a silly way to think about it kind of, but imagine if you kept doing that, you're kind of building up this bank of all these mistakes that you've made, but you've learnt from, and you're not going to make them again. You've got this whole tally of mistakes that you won't make again, which if you think about it, it's like, what do you want? You want to have as many scenarios that you won't make a mistake in as possible. And one way to do that is to have already made the mistake. So you get, imagine you're 5-10 years into your career and you've taken this cycle where you push the limits, you crash, take responsibility, and then you grow. In 5-10 years, you have this whole resume of experience and mistakes that you've made that you won't make again. And that makes you like probably very proficient, very valuable. You've learned things the hard way. You've made the mistakes rather than, in theory, you could have a resume where you haven't made a single mistake, but it's because you've never really put yourself in a role or a position where you've been challenged. So your capability isn't going to be anywhere near as good as what it would be if you had pushed the limits, taken accountability, and grown from it. Now, when I was thinking about this, I've had my own experiences throughout my career like this as well, where I've pushed the limits, crashed, and then you got to. And the hardest bit probably is taking accountability and taking responsibility, because the easiest thing to do, and humans, we are so good at this. We are so good at taking the credit when things go well. That was because of my hard work, and that was because I did this, and yada, yada, yada. And then as soon as things go pear-shaped, we're so good at just obfuscating responsibility and just pushing it outwards, right? Stephen Covey, I don't think it was his concept, but he talked about an internal locus of control versus an external locus of control. And that kind of plays into this. It's kind of a similar thing where it's do you see yourself as in the driver's seat, responsible for what happens in your life? Or do you see it externally? You see things outside you. Oh, it's because of the weather. It's because of the market, whatever it might be. Anyway, so I've had, many of my own experiences with this, but if I share just one with you, it would be, and I think I might have already discussed it briefly on this channel. I'm not sure. I talk about it a lot because, I really learnt a lot from it. But it was, what are we in now? We're in 2024. It must have been at the end of 2022, I think, maybe. I had, and what was I? Can't remember if I was a senior consultant or a manager at the time, but I had this idea for like a new offering that I thought we could sell at the firm to our clients, and put all this time into kind of pitching it, let's say, to get kind of initial feedback on it, and then building it out. I'm obviously not going to talk about the specifics of what the thing was, but building it out, piloting it with like clients and that sort of thing. And there was probably a process of like over a year. It must have been like nearly 18 months or something. And ultimately, if I judge it on dollar value and what it brought, you know, in terms of revenue and that sort of thing, like it was a crash. It was a crash and burn. It was a failure by that metric, by like in terms of what I was trying to achieve and what you're, you know, measured on, you know, in a business like consulting, which is often, you know, revenue that you bring in. Sorry, it was a failure. It was a crash. But in the process, I learned so much and I gained so many skills that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't gone through that, right? I learned a lot about commercials and pricing. So like, what does the process look like when you're trying to create something new, trying to get approvals for it, you're trying to build pitch decks and that sort of thing, and then how you price it. You could argue that I basically got a how-to guide in how not to do it, given that like it wasn't ultimately successful, but that's still valuable, right? You learn what not to do. Pitching, like I mentioned, creating pitch decks. Like I gave so many pitches on this thing, like so many partners had to listen to me pitch this thing to them. And learned a lot about like product design as well. Like when I was doing this, it was around about the time when I was reading the biography of Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. So I was thinking a lot about like product design and how do you make something beautiful and how do you put craft and love into something. And so I learned a lot about, like I got to experience trying to do that. And again, it's not that I nailed it, right? But I got experience in learning how to do it. So in this scenario, I set myself a goal which was big, ambitious. Like I wanted to create my own thing and sell it, which for where I was at the time was like a big, ambitious thing. And ultimately, I ended up crashing from it. But when I look back on it, and rather than just trying to blame, you know, the easy thing to do in that scenario is to be like, people don't get it. They don't understand. They don't understand the value they're missing out on, and, you know, yada, yada, yada. I can't get these approvals, whatever it might be. But if you take that view, you get absolutely nothing out of the experience. So what I'd much rather do is you take that internal locus of control, you put it on yourself and you go, well, if people didn't understand the value, then it's because I didn't explain it to them well enough. I couldn't communicate it in a way that spoke to their values. Maybe I was trying to pitch to them that it would help them on this metric, but they actually care about that metric. And if I'd have realized that, I could have been more effective. Similar thing like, oh, I couldn't get these approvals internally, whatever it may be. Well, again, maybe it's because I didn't quite refine the message of what I was trying to achieve enough. Or maybe it's because I didn't put the right safeguards in place to give different people confidence that they could approve this, whatever it is, right? But again, coming back to what Adrian Newey said about Sebastian Vettel, you want to push the limits, crash, take responsibility, learn, grow, and don't make the same mistake again. Time will tell if I make the same mistake again. Hopefully I don't. I will make similar mistakes, but not the same one. Because if you make the same mistake, then you probably haven't learned from it. So what does all that mean? I kind of told 4 stories there. Talked about Disney's Folly, Ed Catmull and Pixar, Sebastian Vettel, and my own kind of experience. And really, like, the message that I'm trying to get across, and I think, again, a few videos ago I spoke about a similar thing, because it's just a common pattern in life. You see it in all different fields. Again, I've talked about computer animation, I've talked about, you know, hand-drawn animation, talked about Formula One, and I've talked about like consulting from my own experience, but they all share a similar theme and a similar message, which is like, step into the unknown, set goals that seem big and ambitious. We're at the start of the financial year at the moment as I record this, and so I've had a lot of conversations around like goal setting and what do people want to get out of the next financial year. And I think one of the best ways, in my experience, one of the best ways that I like to think about it is that I want to set big, ambitious goals where I'm not sure if I'm going to achieve them, but I can see a way that I can. I can see it's not something so crazy where I'm like, there's no way I can achieve that. But something big where I can go, I can see how I can make that happen. I don't know if I can make it happen, but I can see how it could happen. Because in the process of setting a big goal like that, even if you don't achieve it, right? Because you could achieve it, and if you achieve it, that's a tick, that's a big W, right? But let's say even if you don't achieve it, from my experience, the times I haven't achieved those big goals, I have still achieved more than what I would have if I hadn't set the big goals. If I'd set something more conservative and moderate, I would have just met that bar. But when you set a goal up here, maybe you get here and you don't quite achieve it, but you got close, versus setting a goal down here in the first place, you're not going to achieve as much. So step into the unknown, like set big, audacious goals, even if people think you're crazy. If they start throwing out, Brock's Folly, or whatever your name is, Folly. Walt Disney went through it, and Walt Disney is a guy whose name still lives on to this day, right? I mean, how many years ago did he start Walt Disney Animation? It was probably it was over 100 years ago, right? They had their 100th anniversary just last year, I think. And the man is no longer on this earth walking with us, but people still know the name. So again, set the big, audacious goals. Pick off those things that you're not quite sure if you can swallow and chew, and just go for it, because in the process you'll probably get more out of yourself anyway than what you would have. You'll prove people wrong, or you'll prove yourself wrong, and you'll achieve them, right? But even if you don't achieve them, you'll have pushed your own potential, you will have grown faster in the process, and you will have accumulated experience quicker than people around you. And especially if you're at the start of your career, I kind of think of it like an experience game, right? Like if you're just starting a career, in consulting or whatever it is, you've got the next, let's say 40 years ahead of you to work. When you think about it like that, if you think about trying to build the best career possible, you've got 40 years, and it's like, heck, wouldn't it be great to spend the first 5 just like trying to farm as many experiences as you can, like fail as many times, make as many mistakes? Because you do all that in 5 years, and then you've got the next 35 years of your career to use what you've learned from those mistakes. You know what I mean? Which is very different to when you're in the last 5 years of your career. So take advantage of it. Just farm experiences. Just fail. Just do all those things. Set big, ambitious goals, and just go for it. That's my spiel. That's my spiel for today. If you got value out of this video, again, think about what is that thing. Like, I feel like everyone's got that thing in the back of their mind where they've thought about doing it, but they're like, oh, nah, probably want to just set the fucking goal. Just write it down on paper. I used to have this practice, which I'm working on bringing back at the moment, where every morning I would just on a piece of paper write down what my goals were. And I found that such a powerful tool to keep me grounded and centered in terms of reminding myself what they were. Because the easiest thing is to set goals and never look at them again. And in fact, I discussed this in last week's video, so I won't go down that rabbit hole, but set the big goal. If you got value out of this video, please give it a like. I appreciate all the likes that come through on the videos. It really helps get the content out there to more people. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. And in the description, I'll have a link to the 8-week consulting challenge. Join it. It's completely free. You put your email in and you'll get an email once a week on a Monday morning for 8 weeks. And each week focuses on a different topic, a different thing that I've kind of used to progress my own career that I've found useful. And I'll share with you what that thing is and how you can implement it for yourself. Even if you're not in consulting, if you're just someone, starting your career in whatever field, I'm sure there'll be stuff that'll be useful for you in that. So go check it out. But otherwise,